You're listening to Conversations with Chanda, a Minneapolis Foundation podcast that unpacks the community's grittiest, most vexing problems, hosted by Chanda Smith Baker. During this episode, Chanda had the pleasure of speaking with Tish Jones, an accomplished poet, narrative strategist, cultural producer, and educator based in St. Paul, Minnesota. Tish's work as a performance artist has been featured in various venues across the United States and around the globe. But don't miss the end of the interview, where Tish shares a stunning piece of spoken artistry. And in case you're unable to listen to the complete interview, you can also find this episode on the Conversations with Chanda podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. Simply search for Conversations with Chanda, spelled Chanda, and enjoy the show.
I am Tish Jones. I'm a poet, cultural producer, and strategist, arts administrator. I serve as the founding executive director of TruArtSpeaks, which is an arts and culture organization based in St. Paul. I do a lot of work across the country, across the globe, just making space for artists and creatives, specifically Black artists and creatives, and sort of helping build the infrastructure of organizations that are interested in these intersections of arts, equity, and civic engagement.
I have watched you over the years. I think I first remember seeing you when you were doing work with Sandra Samuels. Was it the Peace Foundation then?
It was the Peace Foundation back then. Look at you. You threw it back.
Threw it way back. Yeah.
Yeah, you did.
Yeah. And so you came out really as an artist, speaking to the issues that were happening in community related to violence.
Yes. Those days, that was back in 2006. Yeah. So part of my work then was really thinking about the work with the Peace Foundation specifically, I should say, is thinking about the violence that was taking place in North Minneapolis. Not just cataloging, but supporting survivors, whether that be, family members, loved ones, partners, children, et cetera, and honoring the lives and the memory of folks who were murdered in North Minneapolis at the time.
I consider myself a creative, and in terms of how I approach and how I think through issues and the solutions that I surface. One of the ways that showed up in my world was in connection to my cousin getting murdered, Chris Miller. I had ran into an exhibit of weapons that had been given to artists in New Orleans. And we brought that exhibit here, and it clicked for me because it was right at the time of the 5th anniversary of his death. And I felt like I was in this deep mourning over that time period. It had happened my first week of being CEO at Pillsbury United Communities. And I've often described it as being at the height of my career and the depth of my grief personally, like a high and a low, like trying to navigate that publicly was probably the most tension I've personally experienced in my body ever. Like I've had 2 moments like that in my career. But anyway, I seen this work and it spoke to me so much about how just the act of being creative can provide an opportunity for healing. And so we brought that exhibit here. And then from that really surfaced Art is My Weapon that Nikki McCombs now runs. And so we did that. We did a gun buyback and then gave those decommissioned weapons to artists throughout the city. And artists who maybe didn't even know they were artists, but people that had gone through grief, violence, impacts related to violence, for them to use those weapons as inspiration to create and to heal. Can you talk a little bit about art and creativity as a tool for healing?
Yeah, I definitely can. First of all, thank you for sharing everything that you just shared. I think that's super important. And it's always really heartwarming and inspiring for me to hear stories of, there being a gift or a positive outcome that comes after such a deep and tragic loss. So I'm really inspired to hear what you did and the opportunities you created for other people to sort of experience art and utilize art and be moved by this experience that you were also moved by, that helped you navigate and was a part of your healing process. And I'm sorry for your loss.
Yeah.
So,
and I just have to say, like, even for me, like every time I see that work or I see works that came from that, I feel like it's a tribute to his life, right? That I was able to do something to honor him. So I try to say his name in all the ways that I can. Even seeing something on the wall is like, it just warms my heart. So
yeah, for sure. And good on you for doing that, right? Because that's the power of the work. Because art and creation is an iterative process, so it keeps living. So that's powerful. So it's twofold, right? Especially in the performing arts world, and when in terms of working in development spaces with young artists too, which is a lot of what I do. We always say first that art can be therapeutic, but it isn't therapy, which is really important, because there are some things that art can provide for you. There's a space that art can provide for you, but it is not the only space. There are other things that we need to be sure that we're doing to take care of ourselves. With that said, right, I've seen art sort of be the catalyst to someone's healing, right? I think I can speak personally for myself. What I was thinking of when I heard you, when I was listening to you share 2020. I mean, 2020 was a really, really difficult year before our brother George Floyd was murdered, right? Breonna Taylor was murdered, right? Ahmaud Arbery was hunted and gunned down. And so it was actually, for me, and, and the Black Lives Matter movement before that, and sort of being over inundated with the videos of Black people being murdered and having to see that, for years. It was in the news cycle heavy in a way that it hadn't been in my lifetime, probably for about 5 years prior to George Floyd being murdered. And then the research, the amazing and wonderful, life-changing, system-changing research from Grassroots Jackson around this data that every 28 hours, a Black person is murdered by a police officer, a vigilante, or a security guard, right? So having all of that in my mind, really since the murder of Jamar Clark, is when I started to really do my own independent research and look into all of these movements for Black lives. But then when Ahmaud Arbery was killed, that took me out. I was like, I have people in Mississippi. My people are from Mississippi. I just left Mississippi 2 weeks ago, and I was in Utica. So I'm like, I know these communities, and I love to run. So I'm like, man, this brother was jogging, and they trapped him and they hunted him. Like he was fawn. You know what I mean? I was like, wow, that was unbelievable to me that they did that. Yeah, so I was taken completely out, and I couldn't think about anything else or do anything else until I created a piece of art. Like, the art is what helped sort of pull me out of a sense of feeling stuck, because I couldn't find the words for it. I couldn't have conversations. And sometimes when you're perceived as a leader, or when you're in a leadership position, when you're called to leave a comment here, or et cetera, you're supposed to have the words. And I just did not have the words. I was sitting with so much pain and so much anger, and it's righteous. It's righteous anger. It's justified. And also, as a Black woman, there's very little space for me to be angry publicly, right? So I was sitting with all of that, really conscious of it. And I wrote this poem for Ahmaud Arbery. And it encompasses, the feeling I have about the experience that Black folks have in America within this sort of, with the permissions that other folks have to end our life, right? And to have such complete disregard for our life, and how cyclical that is, and how cyclical it's been for the history of our existence in this country, on this land. And if I hadn't gotten that poem out, I would probably still be back in 2020 mentally and emotionally. So there is something that art does in terms of evoking an emotion, having having a connection to a specific image, because even for performance artists, MCs or poets or singers, there are images that are created, right? So there are these images that are evoked, these feelings that are evoked in a painting and a dance piece, etc., that are emotionally stirring and moving and can put a sort of new kind of language or feeling to something that you may be feeling and experiencing that helps you move through. So I've seen that in my own work. I've seen that in the work of other people. I think about Basquiat's work. Basquiat's work has done that for me in terms of being critical commentary. I think about Kehinde Wiley's work. Kehinde Wiley's work has done that for me and made us beautiful in these wonderful ways that we need to see in a time where we're being, painted as ugly, and a different kind of ugly. With the way that the media shows our execution, we're, most often depicted as a dying thing. And to see all this growth, beauty, flowers, vibrant colors around us, right? There's another visual artist who I really love, and I can't remember their name right now, but they have these sort of images of these really hard, tough, looking guys in just royal regalia with crowns and jewelry and just adorned in these gorgeous drapes of gold and et cetera, et cetera. And it's just these beautiful juxtapositions of how royal and regal and beautiful we are. And that is inspiring. It's a good juxtaposition to everything else that we see. I feel, the same when I first read, I should say, Danez Smith's poem. I think it's called Alternate Names for Black Boys. It's a really short poem that is so powerful. And the gist of it is like, it's oscillating between giving us names that are about life, and then the tension of these other names, for instance, calling us dead or calling us worthless. So the tension around those things. Art is one of those tools to help you make sense of things that seem otherwise nonsensical, that you can't rationalize. Art is the language of the spirit.
Yeah. 2020 was, I said I had two moments in my career. 2020 was the other moment. So I can feel it. I can feel my reflection. I can feel my emotion, actually, as you were talking. It was all that, plus my mother died.
I'm sorry.
And I've shared this before with many, but she came home 2 days before George Floyd was murdered to my home in this room that I'm doing this podcast in for hospice. And then my sister-in-law passed away 6 months later at 45 years old. And it was all of that plus that while leading, right? I was sharing this. And so in a presentation I did earlier this week about the expectation of leadership, and what you said is, as a woman leader, you can't be mad out loud. Can you expound on why? Well, how have you come to that conclusion? Not just mad, but even grieve, right? Like the pressure to perform in those moments. It's not all external, like I can admit that, but that was the hardest. I wonder still, like, am I fully through it even? But, can you say more about why you said that?
I think it's key too, Chanda. It's not just as a woman leader, it's as a Black woman leader. I think there are cultural differences in the way that we express and emote that also make other people's interpretation of how we be, it's always pushed up against whatever their normatives are, whatever their constructs of normalcy happen to be. Like, the Black folk I come from, they get loud, we wail, we shout, we signify, etc. And that's not, that doesn't fit into this box of Western sort of Eurocentric normalcy around what's acceptable in public space, in shared space. And as a Black woman, I'm dealing with centuries of this trope of being an angry Black woman, no matter what. If I walk into a room and I'm not smiling, people still think they can tell me to smile, that if I'm not smiling, I'm unhappy, and that they have permission to tell me to smile, like that's okay, because people still believe that they have control over our bodies, right? So I am really aware of even the kindest thing, because I know people think that's kind, like, hey, smile, go ahead. So nah, you don't get to tell me what to do with my body. You know what I mean? And it's the same when feeling grief, and when you add that cultural component onto it, it's unfortunate because, to your point about it not all being external, the external piece for me is that critique of how I brush up against society and what these norms are and the history of those things. The internal piece is me also having to unlearn the way that I've been conditioned, right? To give myself time to release the idea of whatever it means to be strong, whatever I think that means. And sometimes strength is pause, right? And I think, again, as a Black woman, I don't know that I've given myself permission not to care for everyone, I don't know that I've given myself permission yet to ask for the help that I need when I need it, before it gets dire or before someone has to simply throw me a life vest because they can see me drowning and I'm not able to ask, right? And I think that inside of this pain and grief, sometimes it's like that. Like sometimes I've seen myself suppress the grief to an extent where I look up and I'm in the middle of the ocean and I need the life raft. It's too late because I've been trying to stay afloat and so on and so forth, or work to a degree that's just unhealthy. So there's part of this is that, that's why I led with that art can be therapeutic, but isn't therapy, because I think a thing that's been important for me as I've gotten older in this work, and I'm still really young, as I've gotten older in this work, is the balance of health and wellness and self-care and understanding, having that nuanced understanding that I am not, when I say we, I mean larger society, I think the we is still white men, the we is still, white women, right? And I know we're trying to change that and shift culture, but those are still the standards in the US context. That's still, who industries are seeking to center, who industries are seeking to serve, et cetera. So I have to remember that I am not them and they are not me, right? And I have to remember that my process and practice will be different, and I have to grant myself permission to be who I am, to come from where I come from, and to seek my tribe if I'm going to heal.
Yeah, the conversation that I mentioned that I presented at this week was with a group of educators. They were asking about what they can do to support the academic success of young people. All I could formulate in my mind was for them to acknowledge the grief in which they're living through and to create space for them to be able to communicate and to release and to be in relationship with it. Like that's all I could think of in that moment, right? Because they started out asking me about Black resistance, which I will ask you about. But after I said that, that's where I went to. And so here we are, grown in our profession, right? Learning some coping mechanisms, which includes some creative outlets. And then we've got young people that are operating within a system that also wasn't necessarily designed to allow for them to show up as themselves. And so you work with young people. And so what are you uncovering in your work that would be useful for people to perhaps understand or consider?
Today, what's coming up for me is, I think, what we all know and kind of set to the side or only talk about. I only hear this in the arts and culture field, but the work is relational. And even inside of these, horrendous systems of education as they exist right now, the work is relational. And I think for all of the classroom teachers who have 35 students to their single and lone self as the educator, with 50-minute class periods, no teacher's assistants, no pairs in the space, it's just them and all those bodies, I know that it's really difficult for you to develop, for them to develop these deep and meaningful relationships with 35 students for 50 minutes and try to do that 7 times a day.
Mhm.
And the work is relational, because every individual is going to show up differently. Every individual is going to connect differently. And it is really key to have, some intercultural understanding. So that's a lot of my work for the last, I'll say 6 years has been really invested in developing intercultural relationships to better understand the ways that different cultural communities, what different cultural community practices are around education, around teachers, around mentors, around grief, around ritual, on entering and exiting, and just like as many, around what histories happen, right? So I've been doing these cultural immersion experiences across the country in different communities to have a better understanding, to better be able to relate to the communities that I serve and am a part of. Because as part of it, there was some inspiration to me. I was teaching at a school downtown Minneapolis, and before I taught there, this was like maybe 12 years ago. And before I taught the class, I had to interface with all of the educators in the building. We did a training, and we also received some training from them. And one of the things that they told us, which I had never heard before, which then made me think about this, how important interculturality is. They were like, hey, just so you know, there's a way that the white kids are disruptive in this space that doesn't look like, typical quote unquote disruption. So you'll see the white kids, they'll be really quiet in the back of the room. There might be some note passing. There might be some, it'll just be softer is essentially what they said. And they describe them the same way around disengagement. They're like, them being disengaged doesn't necessarily always look like them talking to one another. They might have their headphones on, their hoodie up, their head down, whatever, but they're not listening to you. So we need to figure out how to, and it was refreshing to not hear folk first talk about Black folks being disengaged because they're talking to each other, et cetera, et cetera. It was really refreshing to be asked to look for these behaviors and to be kind of told like, hey, here's what that might look like in this space. And also to think about the different ways that shows up, right? In different communities and different people and different individuals, because it's also individualized, right? So
Right.
that's something I've been thinking about, that it's relational and it's culturally informed in terms of how people grieve, right? So I think if we're still in the context of 2020, especially in the state of Minnesota, right, we all sort of experienced, what folks are calling the uprising together. We did experience that. And it will hit different for different people. There's just no way around that, right?
Right.
There's a way that, Black men saw themselves in George Floyd that a Middle Eastern brother who lives down the block from 38th in Chicago just may not have, right? There's a history of experience, if you've experienced that type of violence yourself, right, at the hands of the police, that it resonates and it hits with you differently than it will other folk and other bodies. And those types of things really, really make a difference. So the deeper relationship we can have, the better understanding that we can have with one another, and the more conversations we can have with one another, especially our young people, right? And consider what their social environment is before they come to us as we're trying to be in this, this education space with them. I think the better off we will be and the better off they will be. And, we also still have this really whack model of like the banking education, which Freire talks about all the time. We're still also trying to deposit things into folk instead of, having some learning happen based on what our shared experience is and what our interests are.
Yeah. I was even thinking about the expressions of art and the ones that you said that like sort of exhibit joy and light, and thinking about, do our kids even see enough that exhibit joy and light and beauty and the possibility, right? Because I think that we're trying to manage them.
Mm-hmm.
And what do we bring in to inspire?
Mm-hmm.
And that's I recognize it's a very general statement because I know some great educators out there, but collectively, how we look at and what we present to them and the images and the opportunities, I think are just essential, especially in a time like now.
No, I agree with that. I also think this generation is like so smart. when I think about the art that this generation is creating, they are pushing Black joy, right? They are pushing, wellness. They're pushing interculturality. They're pushing cross-cultural collaboration. They're pushing non-normative agendas. I think that, this generation has really great boundaries and ideas around their wellness, which is not to say that there isn't things to be learned, right? Like I value intergenerational exchanges in education so much because we don't have to recreate the wheel, and there are some gems that our elders have to share with us. And these cats are cultivating their own joy when it is missing. They are creating it for themselves, safe spaces, beautiful artwork that is reflective of them. They're being able to express themselves immediately. You know what I mean? Like really stepping into like, this is who I am. And I know that, that couldn't have happened if everything hadn't happened before this moment. But it is also really beautiful to see that they're creating that space. When they don't see the images, they create them.
I love that. I was thinking about like our Phillips Foundation. I was in this conversation and they're like, these kids are going through all this pain and we need to have some wellness and there's mental health issues and we need to have some programming. And the conversation evolved into, and I'm like, sometimes kids just need a game of like pickup game of basketball, right? Yeah. Like sometimes what looks like repair looks like laughter.
For sure.
Right. And so, sometimes addressing issues of grief can look like joy. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. It's not masking, but it's presenting an opportunity to just be in community with shared grief in something that's not just planting you deeper into it. Right. Mm-hmm. And so how do we think about that? And so out of that emerged a beautiful conversation that evolved into these Genius and Joy grants. That we do over the summer. And I love the way that evolved because it was really around wellness and how we present opportunities that's not rooted in pain, but recognize that their pain exists.
That's beautiful. I love that. We need other experiences and we need those experiences. I mean, that's part of the core thing. The historic thing is, being resourced, right? We've historically been under-resourced. Many cultural communities and ethnic communities have been under-resourced. So to be able to have the resources and quote unquote buy the time to feel joy, the kind of joy that you want to experience, that's critical. I love that.
Talk to me about TruArtSpeaks. How did that emerge?
You kind of spoke to one of the three things that kind of inspired it. So as I mentioned, and you sort of brought up, that work with the Peace Foundation was really pivotal. I turned 19 in 2006, and that year we had the third highest murder rate per capita in the country, Minneapolis, when I say we, going into the fall. Because part of my work was to catalog the murders taking place in North Minneapolis and to be with the families, speak to the families, show up for vigils, read poetry, learn about these individuals. That is one of those moments where I learned a lot. I learned what I could, should, and needed to do with my art. I learned a lot about health, wellness, and boundaries, processing grief, holding my own grief and the grief of others, because I also, 3 of the individuals who were murdered that year are individuals that I knew personally as well. So what did it mean to show up to their vigil, their murder site? Because the vigils were also held at the site of their murder. By August, we have 46 murders, and I'm not sure if that was in North Minneapolis alone or if that was in the city of Minneapolis itself. I had to stop, is my point. I couldn't keep going because it was just too much. And I think in my youth and sort of being, to your point, of being conditioned around pain and being, presented these pain points and things like that, I think I thought I was doing some good, and I know I was doing some good, right? In the community with the family, I made really deep connections. I really loved and appreciated that, but internally, that was very difficult. It was very difficult. So that was one of the things, right? And reflecting on that, and also just calling for it all to stop. It was like, that was sort of that intersection arts and social justice or civic engagement. I ended up organizing a protest a silent protest, a community protest on the four corners of Broadway and DuPont. Brought out the four principles of hip hop, collaborated with Roger Cummings to do some graffiti work and signage for the protest, and called every politician I knew, every artist I knew, every person who was, I knew who was perceived as a leader, as well as the families of folk who I've met over time, and just asked us to be a body in the community, protesting the violence that we were committing to one another in the space, right? And asking with our bodies for something different. It was completely outside of the scope of my work with the Peace Foundation. It was also my sort of farewell to that particular type of work, with so much love and grace, you know what I mean? And we did, and it was, there were really clear directives, like we're not speaking to the media, we're speaking to the families of folk, we're speaking to one another. And so the media came, people came, et cetera, but it was just us at this time. And that for me is where a light bulb happened. It was like, this is what you can do with your art. This is actually what you can do with your voice, what community looks like, relationships, et cetera. And from there, we, so TruArtSpeaks have been doing a lot of sort of guerrilla theater and things like that, performance-based things, but this was sort of the chrysalis. And I had, prior to that, had gone to Brave New Voices International Youth Poetry Slam Festival and started to see what a global community could look like, what some really guided facilitation could look like. So it was like, there was that education piece with Brave New Voices International Youth Poetry Slam Festival. There was this really important local cultural piece that was happening at home for me, with that protest and the work from the Peace Foundation. And then I had seen what, Deanna Cummings, Desdemona, Leah Nelson, Teresa Sweetland, and others had done around Be Girl Be and the International Hip Hop Festival that they put together. And I'm like, okay, I think I figured out what this can be. I think that young people are in need of a space and are in need of, like, in my community, that's what I saw. I saw in my community that young people were really in need of a space to be together, to be safe, to be held, and to think about the power that our art can wield, and to think about the global impact, the local and global impact, and have a pathway towards success, and think about mentorship. So that is sort of how TruArtSpeaks came to be. It was really seeing the need of intention around how we were using our art in this space, and thinking about the power that we could have, and seeing all the resources. There was such a rich web of people, right? So, there was Shaka Kali was around early, Roger Cummings was around early, Desmond, all these really wonderful people and leaders that we had access to. And I'm like, man, how can I pull on all these resources and create these pathways for leadership here that are thinking about, healthy ways to engage with young folk creating art, young folk who are interested in arts activism, interested in arts leadership, interested in the way that art can change things and the way they can activate their voice in community.
One of the things when I was at Pillsbury United, we had started a program, I think it was with Washburn, called POV, The Power of Our Voices. And I remember some of those young people were struggling within the norm context, right, of not being proficient, right, in English and comprehension and all this stuff. And then they would go to POV and I would listen to what they were creating. And I'm like, I don't even know that word that you just said. Like, what did you just say? Could you just say that line again? Because you said it so fast. It was so deep. I can't even wrap my mind around what you just said, right? Like, the brilliance displayed was not the data I just read. So what in the world?
Power of Our Voices was such a great program. I love that program first, but that's the thing, right? Is like, that's where this cultural piece is so important, yo. Like, we are so smart when you meet people where they are, when you have these exchanges, when you realize that the work is relational, you actually can peep the genius that is inherent in a person. And we talk about translation, like, even in this sector, language changes so much, right? Like, they're minority to BIPOC to diverse, we need this to be diverse, to we need this to be equitable, to we need, like, language changes so much. And, there are many reasons behind that. But then also, like, how do we translate that within communities who are not in, these professional spaces or fields? So, like, we talk about that all the time. Like, hustlers are great mathematicians. You know what I mean? And so we do these workshops sometimes where we're just translating words, and sometimes it's just super fun. Like, Gouda is money, and so on and so forth. And you know what I mean? Because there's so much genius in our communities, right? And that's why bartering worked for us, because we are actual geniuses, and we're discounted because we don't fit necessarily into these systems. So programs like Power of Our Voices, many of the programming that intermediate arts used to offer, I would also say things TruArtSpeaks offers, Juxtaposition, these programs that are working with young folks specifically and celebrating their genius, celebrating their first language, right? Whether that's Black vernacular, whether, it's literal, like, bilingual art making processes, or if it's, if visual arts is their language, or music, if they're sound technicians, whatever. That's why hip hop to me. You know what I mean? The first party was certainly a party, but it was also an economic opportunity. And we're in this 50th year anniversary. I think it's really important to know that, like, it started as some entrepreneurship stuff. It's like, we don't have the threads to go to school and not get clowned, but you do have these really dope speakers. You do DJ in a way that no one else does. So let's throw this party. You know what I'm saying? I'll organize it. You DJ. We're going to charge this much at the door. And when we go to school in September, ain't nobody going to clown us because we got enough money to be fly. Right? That's how the thing started. We are so smart. So smart. And they've just, figured out how to capitalize off of our intelligence and off of our culture time and time again, where we have to keep recreating new things, which we will, because we're smart, innovative, creative, and genius people. That's the game.
Right. I've been thinking a lot about the 50th anniversary of hip hop and just the influence. And I keep saying, like, the language and the words, like, I think as you go through experiences mean even more to me today than they did back then. And an ability to express, right? When all you have is your words, like when you feel powerless and all you have is your words, and to look at the criticism that came from even within community about what is hip hop. To me, it speaks to what leadership, the impact of leadership, the impact of change, the impact of being different always comes with its criticism, but it doesn't mean that you should stop your expression.
Mm-hmm.
And so I appreciate the backdrop of how that evolved in the entrepreneurship.
Mm-hmm.
And my mom, and man, I just, all the lessons, I think of her, and she would always say the most brilliant people are locked up, right? They're the entrepreneurs. They're the geniuses that were misunderstood. They didn't have the safety net. They didn't have some of the infrastructure and the systems that they needed for their genius to be expressed.
No, that's
and I think about that now, because when I was young, I'm like, what is she talking about, right? But the inclusiveness, her understanding of belonging, her understanding of what community should do was expressed in those statements.
That's right.
Right. They were so informative for me without me recognizing it really at that time. So that's a gift.
Yeah. Shout out to moms, because she's so right.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk about money, because POV, Power of Our Voices, was really I love that program. And there was another one that we also did with the county homeschool, where we brought some of those students and they did art on stage at Pillsbury House.
I was a part of both of these programs, right?
I do know.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, with
J-Dub.
J-Dub, yep, I was gonna say D-Dub, J-Dub. I do know that. But POV was one where I remember a funder, they had moved into literacy, and that program did not qualify anymore under the new standards. And like, this is the most powerful program. And the theater program that we did with the kids, where they were working with, professional playwrights, did not qualify. And I'm like, these are our most powerful programs that are inspiring kids to do better. But because we didn't meet the number of hours and all the whatever expectations on who was leading it, it became more and more challenging at that particular time to raise money to do that. So coming from philanthropy, you're now leading an organization. You talked about underinvestment. You have anything you want to say to those that should be thinking about how they're making investments into this space? Because you also can't look at it in the same way as you might look at some of other investments that you're making.
Oh, certainly. I think we have to reframe like how we're thinking about literacy. I think that's such a good example, right? So like with the work we did in county homeschool, we were introducing those folks to August Wilson. August Wilson is one of the most celebrated playwrights, period. If that ain't literacy, I don't know what is, right? So that the piece also, right, you know, like most folks don't fall in love with literature or art, period, until something resonates with them. So again, to be able to put, you know, fences in front of these young brothers in county homeschool, they learn it, and then they fall in love with language, and then they understand why it's important to learn how to read and write, why it's important to go to your English class so that you can then produce something like this, right? Or to have access to an MC. And MCs are hyperliterate. They have to be poets. Acronym for rap is rhythm and poetry. You have to understand poetry. Where do you first learn poetry? Where are your opportunities? You know, if you don't have an extracurricular space like a TruArtSpeaks and intermediate arts or whatever, you got to go to school, brother. That's just, you know what I mean? That's just what it is. So it's that point of inspiration. So part of what I would offer to foundations and philanthropies is that point of inspiration, of falling in love, of hearing something in your own language, or having it presented to you in a way that the school just, you know, the system doesn't allow space for. Investing in those communities and those community programmings, community centers and those programs in that way, that's so critical. That's so key, because that's where you fall in love. That's the catalyst for a lot of folks' creativity, those extracurricular spaces. I mean, we can track so many folks. Like, I think about, you know, Dua Salah, who's now is a touring artist, dropped a ton of records, is now an actor on multiple Netflix series. Dua started off coming to the Reverb open mic with TruArtSpeaks, right? And now we look at Dua on TV, right? And we're listening to Dua's albums and hoping that they win awards and so on and so forth. But they started off just coming to the community open mic. That is why you make those investments, right?
Actually, I didn't know you were part of the county homeschool. I knew Power of Our Voices. I am one of my, you know, one of the things I used to do when I was there is I would go to those performances. And I went to one that was so powerful where, and I don't know if you were part of this one, but the young men from the county homeschool created these masks.
Yeah, they created the mask. I was definitely a part of that.
Oh man. And I remember there were a couple of things that really hit me with that one. One is that who was in the audience was mostly probation officers. Right. And so there was a stereotype that I brought in, a bias that I brought in terms of how they showed up in kids' lives. And they were there to watch this performance. And I remember at that particular performance, there was one young, brilliant man that was performing that was disappointed because someone from his family didn't show up. And I could see the pain of that. That struck me. But it was basically, this is what I say when my mask is on, was sort of the point of it. This is the performance, and this is what I do when I'm out. But when I take that mask off, this is really what I'm experiencing, and the vulnerability of it.
Come on.
And I was like, I'm about to like gut cry in here. It was so powerful. And I mean, I don't even know how many years ago that was. So I bring this story up. I'm talking with this younger than me guy who's now doing amazing work. And I'm like, you know, I went through this experience and it's county homeschool. And he said, I was part of that performance. Ooh. And I'm just like, tears, right? Like, I'm like, you don't know what that did to me as a leader.
Come on.
Because if you're not sitting in space where you see that level of vision and inspiration and possibility and genius, you're not going to know what exists. right? If you're making decisions from a distance, you're not going to know that this exists if you don't know it's there.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And like, I'm from here. Like, I know that it exists. And I tell people all the time, I'm from the community, and I take it as my personal obligation to continue to know the community as it evolves. It is a daily act.
That's so important.
Right. Of being present and proximate, of learning what is happening as a way to better my decision making on behalf of community.
So important.
I mean, the layers of appreciation I'm having for you to be part of that, because that was genius. And it personally changed me on that day watching that. It was incredible.
Yeah, it was really powerful. I think work like that is some of the work that is the most moving to me. I mean, you can see the benefits, right? So one of the things I loved about working in spaces like Hennepin County Homeschool or the Minneapolis JDC, Totem Town back in the day, is what happens when you bring community into these spaces is if folks fall in love with a deep reflection, because that's all that art is. Art is a series of questions, inquiry, deep reflection, and a creative expression after that thing. When folks fall in love with that process, they get out and they seek you out, right? Mm-hmm. And they seek out an alternative expression of who they are, that new alternative that they've been introduced to, right? That art form and that creative expression. I mean, even education, I spent some time working as a resident teaching artist at PCYC in North Minneapolis several years. And one of the things that would happen is, brothers would get out of a homeschool, county homeschool or JDC, and they'd pop up. And we could never, just for all of the legalities and so on and so forth, we could never, ever tell folks where we would be necessarily, right? But when they would see you, when they come to PYC and be like, oh, you teach here? Oh, man, it would change. Tears, like literal tears would happen because they found that connection. And so then they feel comfortable at this school home now and, are on their pathway to succeed. And the same happens with, some of these brothers that I've worked with in Stillwater, or any of the correctional facilities in the state. When these cats are on the outs, it's life-changing. It is a forever bond, right? And we all need to find ways to express ourselves. So I'm super thankful to you and the work that you do and the work that you have been supporting over these years. And I'm glad to have been able to be a part of some of these really important programs.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I used to go to the JDC. They used to have me come read for Freedom School. My friend Vet, she used to work there, and she'd be like, come read to these kids. I'm like, you want me to come read to the kids that are locked up? And I'm like, please make this make sense for me, right? Because I just could not make it make sense for me. And I'm like, they're not going to pay attention to me. They barely pay, and I went down there and just fell in love with doing it. And I would go every year. And anyway, I remember talking about Pillsbury House at one of them. And though you're right, those faces lit up and they're like, oh, J-Dub, J-Dub, that you good with us, right? Like, and so those relationships, like we talked about the importance of relationships. And I love the idea of when they can see themselves differently, they show up in those alternative, right? Probably their true expression of who they are, right? With their mask off, they're able to make their real selves be seen.
Yeah.
Act into the possibility of who they are. I think the way in which you framed out how to look at those investments are really important to into the work, that creating space where those relationships are built, where people are meeting young people and people in community where they are is important. A lot of times we have things that are so perfectly constructed, and then we want to find people that fit into the construction. And what I heard you say is, no, we need space that is designed for people to come and explore the possibility and the potential of themselves in a space that like pulls it out in a way that then contributes in all the ways, like it just keeps giving. And I think that's a really important takeaway of this conversation.
Yeah.
So thank you for that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. So last question, what brings you hope?
Babies.
Okay.
Babies. The babies bring me hope, yo. I touched on it a little bit, in terms of this next generation, watching what they're doing. And even the littles bring me hope. The way the littles are thinking about life and speaking with them. I'm so hopeful. My the conversations that I have with my 10-year-old nephew make me believe that there is hope for all of us, you know? The conditions that our elders and ancestors have created have made it so there are generations younger than you and I who are coming up, thinking critically, feeling a bit safer to dream, and they have a new set of language to view the world that isn't so hard, that isn't so rigid, you know, where they begin feeling empowered. And I do think that there are generations before art where, you know, the folks just didn't have hope. Folks felt that they were on a specific track. And I think my nephew sees the field, right? And is running through the field and can be whoever he wants to be. He believes that. And that feels really powerful. Versus, you know, when I had the privilege of speaking to folks who were, you know, born into segregation, there was a very limited scope, you know, on who they thought they could be. And they knew very specifically, you know, what they were tasked to do as Black folk. And I think having those conversations with new migrants to this place, you know, I can just see some of the synergies and things like that. So the babies give me hope, yo. I think there's a generation of folk who are going to change the world because they believe in endless possibilities and because they have much more permission. So I'm excited to see the future that we build.
I love it. Tish Jones, y'all. Thank you.
Yo, thank you, sis.
Thank you for tuning in to Conversations with Chanda. That was Tish Jones and our wonderful host, Chanda Smith Baker. Also, if you'd like to listen to previous episodes featuring guests such as Dr. Yusuf Salam, Robin DeAngelo, Heather McGee, Ibram X. Kendi, and many others, you can find all of the podcast episodes on Conversations with Chanda, spelled Chanda. Don't miss out on these incredible conversations. Check them out today.
For Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, et al. Tears collapse on top of your skin like heavy rain. There is wailing all around you when you are born. It is a good thing. We celebrate the hurried and uncertain attempts to breathe. We cradle you and caress your brown skin. Momentarily, we forget the trauma inherent in your blood. When you are born, it is a good thing. We celebrate the ancestors' prayer manifest in the flesh. Momentarily, we forget about the trauma inherent in your blood, our blood. We imagine you living past 23. The ancestors' prayer manifest in the flesh. A future where someone with skin like yours, like soot, like soil, never meets the barrel of a white man's gun, our blood. We imagine you living past 23. Anomaly. A future where someone with skin like yours, like soot, like soil, never meets the barrel of a white man's gun. Our dreams constantly clipped at the wings. We Black. No anomaly. Lucky to be alive. We live as who it could have been. Our dreams constantly clipped at the wings. We Black. No, any moment is one in which a white man might want to claim scared and shoot. We lucky to be alive. We live as who it could have been. Stomaching survivors' guilt like a bad secret only. We know any moment is one in which a white man might want to claim scared and shoot. You did not deserve this. Stomaching survivors' guilt like a bad secret only. We know so much of us dies with each of you, and you did not deserve this. The hurried and uncertain attempts to breathe. We cradle you and caress your brown skin. Much of us dies with each of you. Tears collapse on top of your skin like heavy rain. There is wailing all around you.